Essentially, Assad was only kept in power by Putin, by Russian military support, naval support. Um, and Putin broadcast this as a triumph of Russian diplomacy against the West. And if you look at Russian Telegram, social media, there is absolute fury in Russia. There is absolute humiliation.
We have the former Shadow Culture Secretary Thangam Debonair. She's in the studio. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
And we also have the Sunday Times' Dominic Lawson. Good morning, Dominic.
Good morning.
The brutal 50-year regime in Syria has collapsed in weeks. What can be done to make what comes next better than rule by the Assads? Should the UK try to influence events, or should we be leaving well alone?
Thangam, you have a friend who has family in Syria, and they are celebrating.
Yes, so I spent a lot of the weekend in communication with my friend who's a Syrian woman who lives now in London. And she talked to me a lot about what it's been like for the last 50 years. She was brought up to think Ila Alabad Ya Assad, which, because it rhymes, really sticks in the mind, and it means Assad forever. And she said she was taught, as they all were, that there was only one way, and it was the way of Assad. Now, obviously, then she came to live here, and one of the things she really noticed when she watched me as an opposition politician was the stark contrast between a democracy and not. She used to say, in my country, if you said any of those things, you would be in prison, and only if you were lucky would you not be tortured and possibly killed. Now, after 50 years of totalitarianism, you mentioned, what happens next? And I think it's really important that we don't make the mistakes we've made in the past, but the international community has a real role to play here. We have to help support what happens in Syria. There is civil society. There are multiple communities. It's not an individual sort of homogeneous nation. And yes, at the moment, of course, people are celebrating the fact they're free of Assad. What nobody wants, I'm sure, is to see one regime, one totalitarian regime being replaced by another. There are ways that can be done, but I think we need to be looking at, and I'm sure the UK government is, whether, and if so when, we lift sanctions, because there's been so much suffering. The deadly trade in Captagon, which is a very nasty drug, which has been flooding from Syria into neighbouring countries, that obviously has to be tackled. We also need to make sure that whatever happens, it happens peacefully. So far, that seems to be mainly the case. So, I'm hopeful, but only cautiously, and that reflects the friends of my good friend Reem, who's been talking obviously to her friends over the weekend and her family.
Dominic, we've had the government spokesperson on this morning, Pat McFadden, and he's repeated this to many outlets. He said that that the government needs to look at potentially prescribing as a terrorist organisation HTS, which is not necessarily going to be the whole government, but will probably be part of it in some way. Are you worried about that?
No, it seems quite sensible. I mean, you ask, what should be Britain's role? What is our special place? Well, one of the interesting things is, of course, that Bashar al-Assad studied ophthalmology, was a practicing ophthalmologist in London. His wife is British.
Yeah.
They are now holed up, as we're told, somewhere near Moscow. I think, therefore, we have a peculiar link. And to the extent that we should do anything, we should be leading the campaign to have Assad brought to justice in an international court or elsewhere. And where is the money, the billions that his family have abstracted, leaving the country poverty-stricken, and as Thangam says, therefore, reliant on basically the drugs trade. So I think there is also the question, about 13 million people were displaced as a result of the Syrian civil war. How is their return managed? What can we do to assist in that? That's more of an issue in Germany, where many more settled, because the country needs its people to rebuild itself.
What about Shamima Begum? She's in a camp in northern Syria, and someone made the point that I think it was Pat McFadden made the point that actually it's a different group that control that territory. I understand that all kind of legal avenues of her coming back here, etc., they've been exhausted now. But what are your thoughts on her position, Dominic?
I have very little thoughts on that because I don't think that should be the priority of the British government or now of the British people. The issue is what is happening in Syria, in the Middle East. And by the way, something that we haven't yet mentioned, which is that we should rejoice that it is an extraordinary humiliation for Putin. If you remember, essentially, Assad was only kept in power by Putin, by Russian military support, naval support. And Putin broadcast this as a triumph of Russian diplomacy against the West. And if you look at Russian Telegram, social media, there is absolute fury in Russia. There is absolute humiliation. And I think that we should be rejoicing at this. The fact that the Russian naval forces have had to scuttle from their base in Syria, having already been driven out of Sebastopol. I think there's not nearly enough, if you like, cheering at what has happened in the context of the biggest threat to peace and democracy in Europe that we have faced since the Second World War.
There seems to be a lot of cheering, and you can understand why. You explained yourself that if you've been under a particular, under the boot for 53 years, you are, of course, going to celebrate because you're reunited, perhaps with family members. You find out what happened to people, where they went. You're able to do things that you were not able to do before. And yet, a lot of people have got in touch and said the thing about, getting rid of dictators is what comes next is not always, it's not always milk and honey, is it? And that must be a concern in some people's minds.
Of course, I think it should be a concern in everybody's minds. And two things can be true at the same time. We can rejoice that a people are free of a brutal regime that's been there for 53 years and be concerned and therefore want to step up onto the world stage to support what happens next, being peaceful and working towards some form of representation, some form of democracy. I am cautiously optimistic only, but I think there's also a really interesting thing. Dominic rightly mentions Russia. There's also what has this done to the various other axes of power and influence, such as with Lebanon, with Iran, and what that might do to tilt different power across the Middle East. I think that's really interesting, and we all have skin in that game. We need the Middle East to be stable, and goodness knows it's not. The suffering in Gaza continues. Those hostages still haven't been returned, and we still have Lebanon being attacked and retaliating with also a prescribed terrorist group, Hezbollah, who should have been weakened by the fall of Assad. But that's a complex set of relationships. And a simple way of perhaps summing up some of the hope that I feel is that this will have tilted power away from brutal dictators. What we don't want to happen now is for brutal dictatorship to be replaced by another form of oppression. There's some cautiously optimistic signs here.
How safe or how much of a life is Bashar al-Assad, his wife and his 3 children going to have in Russia, do you think? We saw these amazing pictures of the Syrian rebel flag being hoisted outside the Syrian embassy in Moscow, which seemed unusual. But some people, we had Peter Frankopan on, the professor of global history at the University of Oxford, and he said if I was Bashar al-Assad, I'd be very worried and I wouldn't stand near any open windows.
He might be safer if he submits himself to voluntary being brought to the International Criminal Court, as Dominic has mentioned. I think there are crimes. Let's not forget, he gassed his own citizens.
Yes.
He put them into abject poverty. He tortured and disappeared hundreds of thousands of people, who some of whom have survived their years in prison, but many of whom will not have done, all of whom will have been scarred by that experience. He ground his people into poverty, and yet Syria has immense capability. Anyone who knows anything about Syrian culture and Syrian history will know that, for example, there is still civic life in parts of Syria that reflects some of what was there before, but there's also been the systematic destruction of some cultural aspects which really do matter, such as the monuments at Palmyra.
Pat McFadden said that the government can consider de-prescribing HTS. Are you relaxed about that?
I don't think Pat's relaxed about it, but I think he's right. They can consider it, and I think they should consider it, because at the moment we have sanctions against Syria because of Assad. Assad is gone. But if we want to relax those sanctions, we have to be careful about who is going to benefit. We want the Syrian people to benefit, and that's really important. And it may be that the government has to consider the status of HTS as a result.